Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and first my thanks to the India Foundation, in particular to Sri Ram Madhav and to Sri Shourya Doval, and also to the Isha Foundation of Sadhguru Jaggi Vasudev. I have been told that we had only about 1 hour for this session because of some post-lunch timetable obligations. So I have requested the speakers to limit their remarks to 10, 12 minutes in order to leave a little time for a discussion at the end. Then I must say that as an introduction, I have been handed the sticky wicket to use a term very familiar to the contemporary Indian culture, because I'm supposed to speak about essentially about Semitic religions. And I was told by several people that it was not entirely clear what was meant by Semitic. And not only in the Indian context is Semitic a rather hazy notion, but even in the West, there is a great deal of confusion. So I will provide as an introduction, since I am the only person of European origin on this panel, a very brief introduction to the history of the ideas. And then I let the speakers expound on one particular aspect which concerns them especially, which is essentially, well, primarily the Islamic situation, and particularly the Islamic contemporary situation in India. Now, Semitic actually comes from Sem, who is one of the patriarchs of the Bible, of the Old Testament, and also a prophet, the first son of Noah. And Sem is supposed to have a very numerous progeny. We are not talking races. Race is a concept which is quite foreign to ancient civilizations. It was a lineage. And in the lineage of Sem, we find a number of prophets. And the first one who is identified as a specific prophet of the Semitic peoples is Abraham. And then after him, we have a whole long line going down to Moses and further down. So, and of course, Ishmael on the side of the Arabs. So it is the tradition and the culture inherited by the descendants of Abraham that is normally described as Semitic or Abrahamic. I might incidentally point out that the concept of Semites or Semites that is carried in the Old Testament is not connected to the 19th century concept of a Semitic race, which became popular in Europe, because interestingly enough, you find in Kabbalistic writings of the early part of the Common Era references to the lands of Goter and Yoktan, which are described as Semitic, and which actually correspond to today's Afghanistan and Pakistan, which means that in that Hebrew cosmology, what is today Pakistan was regarded as Semitic. I'll let you ponder that. Now, why is the notion of a Semitic family of ideas relevant? Well, because, let's face it, Semitic religions conquered vast part of the world, and from the 17th century onwards, there was a general perception that they were on their way to taking over all of humanity, in particular Christianity and Islam. And if you read Macaulay, who is highly, if not popular, at least quite famous in India, you see how he was expatiating on the irreversible spread of Christian civilization and how all pagan, polytheistic civilizations were bound to disappear. So the concept of a Semitic civilization was intimately tied in his mind and in the European mind primarily to Christianity, but also, of course, what came to be known as Judeo-Christianity, because very often the Jewish and Christian civilization came together, even if they had their internal disputes, and also the Islamic civilization. And we see that even today, practically all of Africa has become either Christian or Muslim. There are very few people who still practice the traditional African religions. All of South America, with a few exceptions, is also Semitic, you might say. North America is the same, and in Asia, there has been a great deal of headway being done, and as you know, even in China, there is a great deal of concern on the part of the political leadership that tens of millions, if not maybe over 100 million Chinese have been publicly or unofficially converted to Christianity. Now, to end this introductory remark, I will say that what characterizes Semitic religions in general and very broadly is one, the belief, and belief stands above reason because it was given from the beginning by the prophets. So it is a belief in one God who is overwhelmingly attributed male characteristics. Then there is an exclusionary concept that you cannot associate this religion to any other. If you follow a Semitic religion, you are not supposed to worship or pay respect to any other divinity. And three, that there is an obligation as a human being to fight for your God, to defend his primacy, and to eventually push back or even eradicate other religions. And we find that in the Old Testament, you know, where the Hebrews burnt the sacred groves of the pagans, or where when he got married, Jacob took away the idols of his father-in-law so that he couldn't worship them anymore. So these are references which have been, of course, carried through history and which find their application in the Christian tradition and also in the Muslim tradition, in such things as holy war, and also the inability to have an equal relationship with non-believing monotheistic people, because either they should be clients or guests, or they should live in a separate state. And in the West, this was carried also quite far, because in the 17th century, with the beginning of Enlightenment, we had the concept of cuius egio, eius religio, which means the religion of the king should be the religion of his people. There is no room for anybody else to practice another religion. So we see that this is a very widespread concept, and it is, as I said, even today dominant. And even though Christianity is going through a great deal of turmoil and questioning, there is still a concept that Christianity provides, in a way, the only path to rationality. So in that sense, monotheism and atheism often have a strange association, insofar as they are united in their fight against polytheism, paganism, idolatry, etc., etc. And then, if you look at modern science, and this is where I will end, you will see that surreptitiously, a lot of monotheistic concepts have penetrated modern science. For example, the Big Bang, which was, the theory was built by a Jesuit who was a professor of physics, and the Big Bang is an attempt to reconcile the theory of creation in the Bible with modern cosmology. Then you have, for example, the concept of anthropism, which means that humans are central and that the universe exists only because humans are there, and technically there couldn't be any other intelligent superior life anywhere in the universe. And finally, you have the concept of intangible, eternal, unchanging laws, basically like a code of law like the Decalogue. And yet, science discovers that laws may not be unchangeable, and there are quite a few prominent scientists, including my friend Rupert Sheldrake, who are convinced that laws are actually changing. There are no such thing as unchanging laws of nature. An unchanging law of nature is only a projection of theology into science. Now, with this brief introduction, where I've tried to do justice or injustice to Semitic civilizations in general, I will ask the first speaker, Tufail Ahmed Zahab, to give us his own insight into some of the things that have to be, in his view, carried out in terms of internal work, in terms of internal churning in the current Islamic philosophical and also political and social concepts and applications.
I'm not a speaker, which means please pay attention. I am thankful to the Indian Foundation for inviting me to this conference. In Bihar, in Champaran, where Valmiki wrote Ramayana, I went to study at a madrasa. This afternoon, I am humbled to be in the company of some of the finest minds fighting for the defense of Indian civilization. Two questions are going through my mind at this time. We are being told that peaceful conversions to Islam are fine. For example, the Hindu girl converting to Islam to marry Imam Bukhari's son peacefully. So the first question is peaceful Islam compatible with the 21st century's ideas of liberty? The second question is, since the Quran and the Hadiths are not going to change, and I do not believe that's going to change in the next 1 century, is there a way to introduce change among Indian Muslims? Let me take the second point first. By 2050, India will have the largest Muslim population, approximately 311 million. The modern democratic Indian state must undertake some concrete steps now. One, under the Right to Education Act, all children, all Indian children between the ages of 6 and 14 must be in proper schools, which means not in madrasas, during the school hours of the day, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. A proper school means what? It means students must achieve the same educational outcomes in mathematics and other material sciences which students from mainstream schools achieve. If a specific madrasa does not deliver these educational metrics, it must be banned as unconstitutional in violation of the Right to Education Act. Two, madrasas are a threat to liberty. They are counter-liberty movements. They are incompatible with the 21st century's ideas of liberty and human rights. Secular Hindus and Islamic scholars both defend madrasas in the name of religious freedom. But under the Indian Constitution, among all the fundamental rights, the right to religion is the most inferior. I repeat, the most inferior, the weakest right available to Indian citizens. And if you want to read, you can read Right to Religion, Article 25, subsection 25.1 and 25.2, both of which are absolutely clear that right to religion is the weakest right available to Indian citizens. I am not saying that the right to religion does not exist. My argument is that the right to religion is superseded by all other fundamental rights. Let me explain. I have a fundamental right to eat. I have a fundamental right to drink. I have a fundamental right to breathe. But my fundamental right to breathe will override my fundamental right to eat and drink. The Constitution is clear. I mean, it's a matter of interpretation. Also, the right to religion cannot be a fundamental right before 18 years of age. If you can't have sex before 18 years, if you can't vote before 18, then I don't think that you can have a fundamental right to religion before the age of 18. Madrasas capture Muslim child's mind during the critical 6 to 14 years of age, and my mind this afternoon is devoted to thinking what can be done concretely about this. 6 to 14 years of age is an age when children are required to be protected by the Indian Constitution under the Right to Education Act. For this age group, madrasas should be allowed to teach the Quran and the Hadiths outside the school hours of the day or after 14 years of age. If we follow this constitutional measure, we can hope that at least 20% of Indian Muslims will emerge as agents of social change in the next half a century, not now. My biggest worry is this, and I see a lot of people here who are going to be chief ministers, federal ministers. My worry is that the Indian state has abdicated its role regarding our children in this age group of 6 to 14. Not only this, the Indian state has not only abdicated its role, it has allowed its role regarding our children's future and well-being to be substituted by religious institutions like madrasas. Regarding the Uniform Civil Code, the spirit of the Indian Constitution is absolutely clear, but Indian judges have regularly failed to interpret it in a right way. As per the Constitution, the Indian state is not empowered to see Muslims or Hindus or Christians as communities. The Indian state is empowered by the Constitution to view every Indian as a citizen, full stop. It means if a Muslim woman, any Muslim woman, went to the court to claim that her right to equality is undermined by Muslim personal laws, her right will prevail over the community laws, over the Muslim personal laws. Under the Indian Constitution, a community does not have any right over the individual. The Muslim siege mentality and minority syndrome reside in religious rights, Hindu-Muslim rights, and quota politics. So what can we do about it? Secular Hindus promote this mentality because it sustains their idea of secularism. To remove siege mentality, India must ensure radical zero-tolerance police reforms, and we must make quota politics redundant. How we can make quota politics redundant in our country's political conversation? There are ways. I mean, one way is we should evolve a policy of free books, free clothes, and free schooling for children of all BPL card holders, those families which are below poverty level, irrespective of their religion and caste. And this can practically undermine the quota politics in the country. This is doable. To return to the first question, is peaceful Islam compatible with liberty? Secular Hindus tell Muslims, we will give you secularism and 5% quota. Instead, as a Muslim, I want secular Hindu leaders to come and tell me, we do not promise you 5% quota, but we will guarantee your daughter mathematics, economics, and sciences from grade 1. My argument for Muslim parents is this: if you can teach the Quran from LKG level, why cannot you teach mathematics from grade 1? The argument must stay within the ambit of the Right to Education Act. The Arab Spring failed because there was no infrastructure of liberal ideas in the Muslim societies. The Islamic State or ISIS gained support globally, even in India, because conducive ideas already exist in our societies. The ideas due to which jihadists attacked Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris are already propagated on a wide scale by Braillevi scholars across India, especially with regard to blasphemy and apostasy. To conclude, as a long-term strategy, the Indian government must introduce 3 textbooks from grade 1 through grade 12. 1 on Indian classics such as Upanishads, Mahabharata, Gita, and classical Indian thinkers. Second, a primer on the Indian Constitution's ideals regarding equality, especially about equality of women. Third, a primer containing good points from all religions. These are must, and the federal government cannot walk away from its responsibility by arguing that education is a state subject. 4 Mumbai youths who went to Iraq and joined ISIS, they went about 2 months before Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself as the caliph of all Muslims. Later, some Muslims went from Kerala and Azamgarh. Others were stopped in Hyderabad and Kolkata from leaving India. One youth was preparing to carry out a suicide attack at the American school in Bandra, Mumbai. Indians based in Australia, Singapore, AFPAC region, UAE, Qatar, and elsewhere went to Syria and joined ISIS. Currently, pro-ISIS activity is being noticed in a dozen Indian states, from Assam to UP, from Maharashtra to Andhra Pradesh and Kerala. At present, the number of Indians in Syria could be about 50, going up to 300. For Islamic reformation, a vital question is it possible that an entire generation of Muslim youths can abandon ideas inherited from their parents and Islamic clerics? Fortunately, history gives us hopeful lessons. In Italy and Germany, for example, a generation of youths abandoned their parents' belief in Nazism and fascism. In India itself, Hindu youths have abandoned castes and sati. Christianity and Judaism went through their internal conflicts. The Bible and the Torah were removed from public life. In India itself, the Manu Smriti has been abandoned. Since Islam is the youngest of the Middle Eastern religions, there is hope. The role of Quran must be limited to mosques, and we must study peaceful Islam, and the Islamic reformation must begin now within the age group 6 to 14 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am happy to see that you provided some useful reflections on the very various notions of secularism, because in AA, secularism is also a church word, which meant that the church has to adapt to the world. So when we think secularism is one thing and one thing alone, we obviously should think again. Now let me request Sri Kanchan Gupta to give us his views, which I believe have more to do with the political and state treatment of religious and minority matters.
Namaskar. I would like to begin by thanking Ram Madhavji. He has been very kind and supportive. Shaurya Doval, my colleagues at India Foundation and the Isha Foundation. This subject by itself is quite intriguing, because it would intrinsically also include anti-Semitism, something which we have not known in India. And of the three Semitic faiths, we had Jews over here who lived very happily, very comfortably. Unfortunately, they left for the state of Israel. The other two faiths we have over here, Christians and Muslims, the record is uneven, but on the whole, I don't think there is any anti-Semitic impulse in Indian society. Before I get into it, there are elements which add up to anti-Semitism. The idea of heresy. In the last panel, it was briefly touched upon. Hindu Samaj never had any idea or concept of heresy. A heretic was as accommodated as a traditionalist or a conformist. The idea of heresy comes in with Islamic rule in the country, and then it gets codified when the British come in with their criminal procedure code. And what we have today is a legacy of British rule. So it's not something which we created or we generated. We should have got rid of it. Sadly, we didn't. Just as, when we talk of tolerance and the existence of conflicting ideas, it needs to be said that the first book to be banned in the country was by Jawaharlal Nehru. And the first amendment to be brought to the Constitution, curbing free speech, was also by Jawaharlal Nehru. So today, to praise him as the leading light of tolerance and democracy and democratic values is a bit of a stretch. Now, coming back to the main thrust of today's discussion, I mean, when we are talking about reform, orthodoxy and reform, ideally the impulse for reform should come from within the community. And that is lasting reform, that is reform which has a certain dynamism to it. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way, and it hasn't happened that way in our country. We had individuals who led the reforms movement. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's name comes to mind. He led from the front for widow remarriage. Then you had institutions and organizations, the Young Bengal movement, the Brahmo Samaj movement, the Bengal Renaissance, all that added up to the reforms impulse. But that was reforms essentially directed at Hindu Samaj, not at the Muslim community or the Christian community, which was quite insulated. Let me come to the first concrete state intervention which happened towards reforms. That was the Sharda Act, the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929, moved by a Hindu, supported across the board by all communities, Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. The select committee which was set up to study the bill and seek opinion, public opinion, received a very long submission from Muslim women asking that the Sharda Act should also cover Muslim girls, and Muslim girls should not be subject to Muslim personal law. That didn't happen. And Sharda Act essentially, which fixed the age of marriage at 14 for girls and 18 for boys, and I'm talking of 1929 when this was considered very reformist, very modern. There was not much political support for it either. 3 separate women's organizations petitioned Motilal Nehru, and they had to actually stand outside his house. They were not allowed to come in. Even Motilal Nehru was not very open about supporting the Sharda Act. Yet the bill was passed, and in 1930 it was notified, and we had the first major state intervention towards reformism. Now, if we cut from there to 1950s, when the Hindu code bills were adopted, again the purpose was that society takes a lot of time to change, the state must intervene and force change and force modernism. At that point of time, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the Prime Minister, he argued that we have the need to finish what the British started towards reforms. But there was no attempt to make that reform pan-Indian in terms of bringing in the 2 major Semitic communities, either the Christians or the Muslims. And there was no compulsion to do it. It's not as if Sharia was always legitimized in this country. It was only in 1937 that Sharia got some form of legitimacy, state legitimacy in this country, and it wasn't free India. We could have junked the 1937 Act and said, sorry, we will have code bills, and those code bills will be equally applicable to everybody. Now, what happened was that the Constitution, in its wisdom, promised equality to everybody. It said that everybody should be equal before the law, and it promised liberty, and it promised fraternity. Basically, the idea was that there will be no discrimination on grounds of religion, on grounds of gender. And yet, despite that, the simultaneous existence of personal laws negates the very opening lines of the Constitution of India, because a Muslim woman or a Christian woman does not enjoy the same equality before law as a Hindu woman. There's a lot to be done to bring about reforms in Hindu Samaj. There's a lot to be done to bring it in tune with modern times, modern aspirations, modern realities. But the advantage which Hindus have over Muslims or Christians, I'll give you an example. The divorce law is the same, but it has a clause that discriminates. If a Hindu couple were to seek divorce through mutual consent, they need to live separately for 1 year. Under the same law, if a Christian couple were to seek divorce through mutual consent, they will have to live separately for 2 years. Now, this kind of inbuilt discrimination negates the idea of equality. It negates the idea, the essential idea of secularism, which was supposed to run through the Constitution, and of course, Article 41, which mandates the state to work towards a uniform civil code. Two major interventionist efforts that were made. One was by Mrs. Indira Gandhi when she was Prime Minister, and she moved the adoption bill in Parliament, the Gokhale bill as it was called, which would enable everybody, whether you are a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian or a Sikh or whatever, to adopt a child. The mere introduction of that bill, people forget today, in 71, led to riots in the streets of India. The Muslims claimed that it was an affront to their faith. This was parallel legislation meant to subvert Sharia, and therefore it must be resisted. And what we know today as the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, which is a totally illegitimate body, it has no legitimacy in law, in state sanctioning its creation, was born in 1971-72, and it is of that recent vintage. And since then, it is the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, the self-appointed guardians of Islamic faith in India, which has been forcing the government to stay off intervention and stay off creating a modern system of of laws which ensure equality. The second opportunity for intervention came in 1986, when the Rajiv Gandhi government, with its huge mandate and with its huge numerical strength in the Lok Sabha, could have forced change after the Shah Bano judgment. And yet, despite that strength, despite overwhelming opinion across the country that this should form the benchmark for initiating the process of a uniform civil code and thereby bringing in community laws, religious laws in tune with modern society, that opportunity too was missed. Instead, what we got was and it's very ironical, the bill was named Muslim Women Protection on Divorce Bill, while the law actually strips them of the right of any protection on divorce. It's only now that again the Supreme Court and the judiciary has started sounding out the government on moving towards a uniform civil code or a common civil code. And I think an intellectual movement is required to force the state to admit that there is a need to bring about equality among communities, to live up to the promise made in the opening lines of the Constitution of India by intervening and forcing reform, because without state intervention, reform is not going to happen. And if we keep on parroting the line that reform must come from within, we can wait for kingdom come, but it's an impossibility, and we might as well forget about it. So I will just leave you with the thought that each one of us has some space, some public space, and we should push for state intervention, we should push for reforms, and ensure that modernity, and by modernity I really don't mean lifestyle modernity, but modernity in terms of equality, in terms of liberty, in terms of individual liberty, individual rights, in terms of fraternity. To fulfill these noble promises of our constitution, of our republic, we really must now push the government and the state to move towards a uniform civil code, because without that, the idea of contesting orthodoxy and bringing in modernity is impossible. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Sri Kanchan Gupta. I was reminded while hearing you that there is that perpetual conflict between concepts of equality and concepts of liberty. You pointed out to individual liberty, and of course many are arguing about community liberty, or the liberty of a particular group of people or religion to behave in a certain way and to follow certain laws. So that's a reflection which very much needs to be indulged in, because in many cases we see that liberty and equality are not easily conciliable. May I now ask our last speaker, Sultan Shahid Sahab, to talk about the theological underpinnings of Islam. He's famous for his New Age Islam website, which I think is a very refreshing term, because when I was in the US, living in the US, I of course was familiar with New Age Islam from Pir Vilayat Khan. And of course it was all about Sufism and embracing the diversity of religions and life through art and through mysticism. I think he's bringing us a more ponderous scriptural vision of it. So, Sultan Shahid.
Thank you, Chair. I'm truly grateful to India Foundation for giving me this opportunity. I'll confine myself, friends, to just a small aspect of Indian Islam, although the subject is very vast. What kind of reform does modernity demand from the orthodoxy? Essentially, it asks Muslims to come out of the insidious trap of supremacism, the dream of making Islam the sole religion of the world, ruling through an Islamic caliph. It demands that Muslims coexist with other religious communities and respect and learn from other religious cultures, other religions and cultures, grant equal rights to all citizens, practice gender equality and justice for all, follow the UN Human Rights Charter. Each one of these goals is supported by the foundational scripture of Islam, the Holy Quran, if only we were to go by the Quranic dictum of finding the best meaning of Quranic verses. This has been explained in chapter 39, verse 55, and many other places in Quran. And follow also the recent advice of His Holiness Pope Francis to find an adequate interpretation of the Quranic verses. Historically, Islam has produced a galaxy of thinkers, philosophers, mystics, theologians, exegetes, experts in hadith. Debates and discussions called Ilmul Kalam have been the norm rather than the exception in Islamic tradition, whether the rulers were intolerant tyrants or broad-minded liberals. Even the rationalist Mu'tazila flourished for a time during the 8th and 10th centuries. Many of the greatest Islamic thinkers spent years in prison, went to the gallows, but never flinched from exercising their right to free thinking and expression. It's only Salafi Wahhabi Islam that prohibits discussion and debates on religious issues. Saudi Arabia has been spending tens of billions of dollars to spread this rigid, desiccated, desert version of Islam called Puritan in the West. Islamism is a variation of this interpretation, which calls for spreading Islam by force. Jihadism is another offshoot that actually seeks to implement it with the force of arms and terrorism. Under Salafism's widespread impact, contemporary Indian Islam presents a rather dismal picture. There is an almost complete stagnation in conversation on issues of vital concern, at a time when Muslim societies around the world are producing armies of Islamist jihadi suicide bombers wherever required by motivated people. Our ulama are almost completely silent. This silence became deafening when the self-declared Khalifa al-Baghdadi said a few months ago that Islam has never been a religion of peace, not even for a day, and that it has always been a religion of violence and war. Not one alim, a scholar, protested or condemned it. The reason for the jihadi ideology's success in attracting Muslim youth is simple. For hundreds of years now, Muslim theologians have been engaged in creating a coherent theology of xenophobia and violence in order to expand the Islamic reach. Classical luminaries of Islam such as Imam Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, Sheikh Sirhandi, Abdul Wahhab, and Shah Waliullah, to 20th century theologians such as Sayyid Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, and Maulana Maududi have worked out a theology which promotes the view that Islam must conquer the world. Genuine Sufis like Mansur al-Hallaj and Ibn Arabi had a very different view and looked at Islam as a spiritual path to salvation. But in their times, Sufis did not feel the need to evolve a coherent theology of peace and pluralism. The result is that today, while a theology of violence is being spread with the impact that an investment of tens of billions of petrodollars can ensure, there is no parallel, comprehensive, coherent theology of peace and pluralism available to oppose it. This is because the so-called moderate theologians too swear by essentially the same core beliefs. For instance, the main basis of the theology of violence is contextual verses of Quran and some narrations of Hadith concerning the wars waged during the Prophet's time, even though they were collected hundreds of years after the Prophet's demise. But no alim is prepared to say in clear terms today that these contextual verses of Quran and Hadith do not apply to Muslims today. Indeed, they all swear by the divinity of Sharia, though it was first codified 120 years after God declared in Surah 5, verse 3, that the religion of Islam had been completed. Let me give you an example. Among the Indian ulama, the most important campaigner for moderate, peaceful Islam is Maulana Wahiduddin Khan. In his book, Islam, Creator of the Modern World, he says, I quote, "It was God's decree that he, Prophet Muhammad, be a da'i, missionary, as well as a mahi, eradicator. He was entrusted by God with the mission of not only proclaiming to the world that superstitious beliefs were based on falsehood, but also of resorting to military action if the need arose to eliminate that system for all time." Unquote. If this is the position of a moderate Indian Muslim cleric, renowned for his efforts at building peace and pluralism, what is stopping jihadis from saying that since that false system will exist, it still exists, it is the duty of the Muslim Ummah to pursue Prophet Muhammad's unfinished mission and use military means to enforce what they consider to be the only correct system. Recently, 120 ulemas from around the world had issued a fatwa in the form of an open letter to Khalifa Baghdadi. I'm not giving details here, but I have studied that and critiqued that, and it is available on my website, newageislam.com. Any of you who are interested in knowing exactly how the moderate ulama are the same as the jihadi ulama and how they are supporting, in fact, the jihadis and our children who are studying them to go to war, you can go to my website and just, there is an internal search engine, you can put in 120 ulama, 120 ulama, and you will find that critique, which indeed, because this is a 14,000 word fatwa, and I have written a detailed analysis of that. Many of us have been placing great hope in the ability of Sufi institutions to take us out of this quagmire of Islamism and growing radicalization. But there has been a deep Wahhabization of Indian Sufism too. Most Sufi shrines across the country are now practicing gender segregation and discrimination. They have started issuing fatwas of apostasy against musicians like A.R. Rahman. Sufi literature has been gradually removed from Sufi madrasas and even replaced by literary books of Sayyid Qutb, the father of modern terrorism in the Middle East. They no longer teach books by Rumi, Ibn al-Arabi, Sheikh Sadi, Khaja Moinuddin Chishti, Baba Farid, Amir Khusro, etc. Even Sufism's basic spiritual philosophy, Wahdatul Wujud, unity of existence, or Advait, has been practically replaced by Wahdatul Shuhud, unity of appearance, or called in English apparentism, to make it acceptable in the present Salafi Wahhabi milieu and to distinguish Islam from Advait Vedanta. The concept of Islam as a spiritual path is clearly giving way in India too to the totalitarianism of political Islam. How can we retrieve the situation and maintain peace and social harmony? The first requirement, in my view, is to evolve a theology of peace and pluralism, rationality and modernity on the basis of values that are now considered universal and which Muslim majority countries have already accepted by signing the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Muslims do have the resources to evolve this theology, both in terms of classical literature and contemporary scholarship. All that needs to be done is to mobilize these resources in a systematic, organized manner. While the evolution of this comprehensive and coherent theology will remain a continuing process, the already available essential elements of this theology should be brought to the Muslim masses. Since support for such a venture cannot be expected from clerics of any hue, popular acceptance of this theology should be gained through the use of media as well as genuine grassroots movements. Essentially, jihadism is a Muslim problem and Muslims must tackle it. But the societies in Muslim majority countries in non-Muslim majority countries can help kick-start the debate. In India, for instance, we should confront the ulama with the poison they spread in their speeches and madrasa textbooks. It must be understood that a madrasa graduate who has been brainwashed into believing, as most are, that life begins in the grave, is a ticking time bomb that should be diffused with the same urgency as other bombs are. A secular government should not allow anyone to spread the poison of intolerance and xenophobia either in mosques or in madrasas. Thank you.
What you reminded us, among other things, Mr. Shaheen, is that mysticism has a great role to play, but it is not always effective in socio-political terms, because in Christianity, as in the other Semitic religions, it has generally been restricted to individual messages, and therefore it has not always percolated down to social and political affairs.